Welcome to my presentation on cost behaviour. Just before we get started, a quick introduction to myself. I'm AAT qualified, studied level 2, 3 and 4. I'm currently working in finance and have been now for 2 years, but my ultimate ambition is to train to teach AAT in the future. The presentations that I do are just about the key concepts of AAT, and they're designed to support the fundamentals that will help you progress through levels 2, 3 and 4. I'm not endorsed by AAT and these materials are my own. I hope these help and prove to be beneficial, and good luck, and most of all enjoy the journey that is AAT. Okay, so let's start by looking at the different types of cost behaviour. So there's 4 types. The first one we'll look at is the fixed behaviour. So fixed behaviour means that it doesn't matter how high your level of activity goes, that cost is always going to stay the same. So whether you produce 10 units or 10,000 units, you are still going to have to pay that cost. So we're going to be thinking about things here like your rent and your rates, okay? So you've got a premises that you're doing your manufacturing in. That is going to cost you, say, £70,000 a year in rent, and then you're going to have an amount for rates as well, which is set by the council. Now, it doesn't matter how much production you do in that facility, you still have to pay those rent and those rate costs. So that will stay the same. Okay, so fixed rates stay the same. So the second one we have is stepped. So a stepped cost is a cost that changes at certain levels of activity. So this means that if you produce up to 10,000 units, your cost is going to be one amount. If you produce up to 30,000 units, then it's going to be a different amount. So at that 10,000 production level, your cost will then go up until you hit 30,000. Okay, so something like a storage facility. So if we think about this, if you're paying for a warehouse or some sort of storage facility for your goods when you've made them, you will, if you increase your activity, then you're going to need more storage. So you could say that you need a certain size warehouse for a 10,000 unit production. However, that will cost you one amount. So say that warehouse will then cost you £1,000. If you then decide that your production is going to increase, that storage cost is actually going to step up to the next size storage unit that you can rent. So if your production is 10,000, up to that 10,000 limit, you'll be paying 1,000. As soon as you go over that 10,000 limit, you're going to have to get more storage. So therefore, your cost is going to step up. So they step up at certain activity levels. We are going to look at this visually in a minute, but we'll just go through each type first of all. So the next one then, variable. This is a cost that always changes. And the key here is that it's in line with activity. Okay, so this is going to be your variable cost, is going to be your direct costs. Okay, so your direct costs are going to be your variable costs of production. And just as a reminder, that is going to be your direct costs are your direct materials and direct labour. So that will go up for as your activity level increases, then your costs will also increase. So then your final one then is your semi-variable. Now your semi-variable has an element of fixed cost, so an amount that will always be there, but it also has an element of the cost that changes with your level of activity. So you have part fixed cost and part variable cost. And to split these, you will use the HighLow method, which we will come to on a later slide. And this is things like your phone bill. Okay, so your phone bill, you have the line rental. The line rental that is a fixed amount per month. And then for the number of calls that you make, perhaps over your inclusive allowance, then you'll be charged per the number of calls. Okay, so that's your phone bill type cost as well. So when we move on, we're going to go on to another slide and we're going to have a look at how these show visually. So this is sort of your overview of what they are, and now we'll move on and have a look at actually how they. Okay, so let's start having a look at these visually then, and we'll start with the two sort of more simple costs to look at. So starting with our fixed costs, so our fixed costs were the costs that don't change with our level of output. So if we've got two axes here, we've got our costs that go up and we've got our output that increases here. So our fixed cost, it doesn't matter what your level of output is, your cost is always going to remain the same. Okay, so that is going to look like this. So it doesn't matter whether you have an output of 50 units or 1,000 units, this cost is always going to be the same. Okay, so at 50 units, we're only going to pay £100, and at 1,000 units, we're still only going to be paying £100. So that's our fixed cost. It always stays the same regardless of your output. So the other cost then that's more straightforward is the variable cost. So our variable costs were our costs that increased with our level of activity. So they're our direct costs, our direct materials, direct labour. So if we bring up our axes again with the costs and the output here, and this time our line is actually going to show like this. So let's have a look. So here's our output, starting output here. We're not producing anything, so we haven't got any costs. So then as our output increases, so our cost starts to increase. So looking at this then, you can see that if we make 50 units, we're going to have a cost here of 10. Then 100, going to come up here, and you're going to see that we've got a cost of about 30. And then here, at 150 units, we're going to go up, and we've got a cost of 40. So it's our variable cost, so it's our cost per unit. So the more units you make, the higher your costs are going to be. So they're quite straightforward. So you've got your fixed costs. These will never move. These are the costs that are, you know, your rent and your rates. And this is your direct material and labour. On the next slide, we'll go on to have a look at the two perhaps slightly more complicated costs. So the next two to look at visually is our stepped and semi-variable costs. So our stepped costs. So here's our axes again, the same axes with our cost and our output. But this time we're going to be looking at the level of activity is a certain cost. So the way I like to actually think about this is I did actually look at it in terms of steps, in terms of blocks, okay? And the bigger the blocks get, the more things you're going to be making. So this probably makes a bit more sense if I bring it up on screen. So first of all, if we have a little look down here, and we can say that in this block here that I've just brought up, that is going to be 100 units, and up to 100 units it's going to cost us, say, £100. So everything within that level of output here, it means your cost is going to be £100. However, if you then decide that your output is going to increase, so we're now up to 200, your cost is then going to increase again. So for everything up to the 200, you then might be paying, I don't know, 350. So the first part here was that for the first up to 100 units was one cost, but then up to 200 units, the cost increases to another one. So if you think back to the storage example I gave you on one of the previous slides, the warehouse or the storage unit that we needed to rent for 100 units will cost this amount. But when we need to increase that storage or start renting another unit because we're then going to increase our output, it's then going to cost us a different amount. So then again, if it then increases again, you're going to step the cost up again, and then again you'll step it up. So for every boundary, so for every limit, so say these were 100 limits here, so from 100 to 200, 200 to 300, 300 to 400 units of output, your costs are going to start stepping up to whatever it might be. Okay, so think of it in terms of boundaries. Think of it in terms of when your output increases to a certain level, you'll pay one cost. As soon as it goes over that limit, over that level, so as soon as we go over this top line here, we then need to go up. And then as soon as we hit this line here, we're going to be going up. This line here, we're going to be going up. Okay. So that's your stepped costs. So this is your storage or your warehouse, something like that. So then the other one then, which is the one that can catch people out, is your semi-variable. So your semi-variable cost is, if you remember, it's a mixture of a fixed cost and your variable cost. So your fixed cost is your cost that doesn't change with your level of output, and your variable cost is the cost that changes in line with your level of output. So how does this look like then on our graph visually? Now in the first instance, you might assume that this is the same as your variable cost. If you remember our variable cost, I'd just do a little diagram up here. We had our variable cost, and our variable cost looked like that as well. However, the difference is your variable cost at zero output, you had zero cost. But with your semi-variable, if you haven't got any output, you still got an element of cost. And that's because you've got this fixed element. So to have a look at what this looks like, your fixed element is going to stay the same. So you have to think about it in terms of what is it you're expecting this cost to include. So when we were looking at our example earlier, we were looking at the phone bills. So the phone bills were the fixed cost, the fixed element of it, and the variable element of it. So your phone bill had the fixed cost here, which is your line rental, and then up here you would have your calls. And that's what makes up that cost. So this is the fixed element, and this bit here is the variable element. So your fixed cost stays the same, and your variable part of it will increase with your level of output. So the key difference then between those two graphs, the variable graph up here that I've just drawn, starts at 0 with cost and 0 output. But your semi-variable, it can't ever start at a 0 cost because you've always got a fixed element. So you're always going to be starting at a cost regardless of what your output is. So we're going to have a look, we're going to certainly have a look at the HighLow method, and we'll do some very quick examples of working out some of the other ones as well. Okay, so let's have a look at an example then for fixed and variable costs. Question here is: a manufacturing company has the following costs of production. Rent £30,000, direct material is £1.50 per unit, and the direct labour is 50p per unit. What's the total cost of producing 15,000 units and the per unit cost? So the question here is asking us for what the total cost is and what each unit will cost. So let's have a look at the cost that we're given. We're given rent, so rent is our fixed cost, because we are going to have to pay rent regardless of how many units we produce. Our direct material cost, that is a variable cost, and so too is our direct labour. So these two will increase as production increases. So let's work out our total cost. So first of all, starting with our direct materials. So our direct material, our total cost for our direct material is going to be our output, which is our 15,000, multiplied by our £1.50 per unit, and that gives us 22,500. Then the next cost we have is our direct labour, and again that's going to be our output, 15,000, multiplied what it costs per unit, and that gives us 7,500. And then don't forget, we've also got our rent, and that's a fixed cost, so that is going to cost us £30,000 regardless of how many units we make. So if we then add all of that together, we get a total cost of £60,000. So our per unit cost is then our total cost, our £60,000, divided by our number of units that we've produced, and that gives us £4 per unit. So just to then quickly show you how that will change, so how the variable costs will change and then your cost per unit will change when you do it with a different level of production. If we had a level of production of, say, 25,000 units, we would then have direct materials of 25,000 units multiplied by £1.50, which gives us 37.5. You'd have your direct labour of your 25,000 units multiplied by your 50p, which gives us 12.5. You're still going to have that same rent cost because it's a fixed cost. So even though we've increased our volume, we're not going to be increasing our rent because that is a fixed cost. So when you add all of that together, you get 80,000 as a total cost. So now you can see how the unit cost is going to be affected, because if you then do your 80,000, so for your unit, if you do 80,000 divided by your new production quantity, your 25,000, that comes out at £3.20 per unit. And that's because your rent is being spread across a lot more units. Whereas with your 15,000 units, you had to spread your £30,000 across 15,000 units. But as our level of production increased, we're then spreading our rent of £30,000 across 25 units. So that's why it then brings down the cost per unit, but that rent cost will stay the same. So hopefully that shows you how the fixed and variable costs will work when you're producing a total cost. And we're going to go on and we're going to have a look at the slightly more complex costs in stepped and semi-variable. So let's have a look at our stepped cost example first. So we've got the same question here, except we have also got some storage costs included. So let's just run through our costs again so we know what costs we're looking at. We've got our rent at 30,000, so that is our fixed cost. We've got our direct material, which is our variable cost. We've got direct labour, which is variable. And then we've got storage costs, and we're told here for the storage costs it's £2,000 for every 5,000 units produced. So they have to rent a warehouse or a storage unit for £2,000, and they can do that for every 5,000 units they produce. So that is going to be our stepped cost. So I'm just going to bring up the little graph that we had earlier because I just want to show how this actually works in visual form. So we've got our costs and our output as normal, and then we're going to have our output going, and because we're told that it's going to increase at every 5,000 units, we know that this section here is 5,000, that's going to be 10, that will be 15, and that would be 20. Okay, so up to the first 5,000 units, it will cost 2,000. But then we're also going to have another 2,000 because we're going up, we're stepping up to the 10,000 units here. So we're stepping up. And then as soon as we go over 10,000, we need to step up to the next bracket again. Okay, so we're going up again, which will be 6,000. And then if we're going to go over the 15,000, we would go up again. And that would be our 8,000. So when you start your production, anything up to the first level here, which is 5,000, will be one cost. And then that increases for every step that you need to take. So for every time you go over that maximum output for that cost, you need to step up to the next cost. So let's work through this example then. So we know some of the figures from the previous slide. So let's work it through. Direct materials is 15,000 units multiplied by 150, and that gave us 22.5. Our direct labour was 15,000 multiplied by 50p, which gave us 7.5. We had our fixed cost of rent, which was just our £30,000. And now we're going to have our storage cost to add on. So because our production is 15,000 units, we're going to have to step up once, then we're stepping up twice, and then we're going to have to step up a third time. So it's going to have to be 6,000, because for the first 5,000 we pay 2,000. For the second 5,000 up to 10,000 we're paying 4,000. And then for the final 5,000, which takes us to our output of 15,000, we're going to be paying 6,000. So if we then add that together, we get £66,000 for a production cost of 15,000 units, which then means our per unit cost is 66,000 divided by the 15,000 production, and that gives us £4.40p per unit. So that's how your stepped costs work. So in the question, you're going to need to identify what levels and what are your boundaries for where your costs are going to start. So if we had a production of 8,000 units, for example, we're going to go over this first box. We fill up this first box, and then we're going to partially fill up this second box. So we're going to have to pay up to that £4,000. We're going to have to pay that £4,000 because we need that capacity of 10,000 to have an 8,000 unit production. So have a look very carefully, identify what your production level is, identify at what point the costs step up into different brackets, and then draw yourself out a little graph or a chart or fill some boxes in, because then you're going to understand then at what point are you going to have to step the cost up. So think of it as filling boxes. We've filled this first 5,000 box here. In this question, we then filled this second 5,000 box here, and then we also filled the last one up to its maximum. So if we then produced 16,000 units, we would then start filling up this fourth one here, and our costs would step up again by another 2,000. So it's important you don't get that confused with just because you go into the next box, you don't split the cost, you have to add on another chunk. So for every box you go into, you're adding on another £2,000 for this question. So I hope that makes a bit more sense for the stepped costs. And we're going to go on and we're going to have a look at our semi-variable costs. So just building on the examples then that we've used before, let's have a look at adding in a semi-variable cost as well. So we've got the same ones, we've got our rent, our direct material, our direct labour and our storage, and now we've also been given a maintenance cost. And we're told that this maintenance cost is £1,500 plus £2.25 per unit. So again, we know that our rent is fixed. Our direct material and direct labour are variable. Our storage cost was our stepped cost. And looking at this, we're told that we have to pay for maintenance, we have to pay £1,500. And on top of that £1,500, we also pay £2.25 per unit. So this is our semi-variable. So let's do our total cost then. So starting with our variable costs first, we've got our direct materials. We're going to be producing 15,000 units multiplied by 150, which is 22.5. Our direct labour, 15,000 multiplied by our 50p is 7.5. We've got our storage costs, and if you remember, we know that because we're going up to 15,000 units, we've got to pay 2,000 per 5,000 units, so that's going to be a total of 6,000. We've got our rent, which is our fixed cost. Regardless of how much we make, we're going to have to pay our £30,000 in rent for our property. And then finally, we've got our maintenance cost. So our maintenance cost then, we're going to have to work out what we're paying in maintenance per unit we're making and add on this element of the fixed part of it. So if we look at our graph, we can see that our cost will always start at 1,500. We can't ever pay less than 1,500 for maintenance because this element of it here, that's our fixed cost. So we will always pay a minimum of 1,500, and then as our output increases, our costs will then go up because we're then paying £2.25 per unit. So when you're looking at your semi-variable costs, make sure you know where your cost is starting. So our calculation for this will be, I'll pop it in a different colour, we're going to do the variable element, the 2.25, and we're going to multiply that out by our 15,000, and that's going to give us a variable maintenance cost of 33,750. But we also need to add on the fixed element of it. So when we come to working out the maintenance side of it, our total is actually going to be 35,250, which is the variable element of it plus the fixed element. So when we then add all of that up together, we then get our total cost of 101,250 for our 15,000 unit production, which then means our per unit is 101,250 divided by our 15,000 level of production, which gives us £6.75 per unit cost. So for this then, when you're given this sort of question, you need to have a look, and you just need to be sure that you are checking what element of the costs and how they behave. So our rent is fixed. We know we're going to have to pay that regardless for our property. Our direct material and our direct labour is always going to move depending on how many units we're producing. Our storage costs here, we're told that we can pay £2,000 up to a certain level, and then for every 5,000 we go up, we have to pay another £2,000. So we're always going to be stepping up the cost as we hit those limits. And then our maintenance, we're told we have to start at 1,500. Our maintenance cost is 1,500, so that's the fixed element of it. But we're also told that for every unit we produce, we also have to pay £2.25 in maintenance cost. And that's the key indicator that it's a semi-variable cost. Just make sure when you do these questions, if you're given, you won't always be given it in this format. You may have to use another method, which we'll come on to in the next slide. But when you do this question, just make sure you sense check your answer before you type it in. So when we done our calculation over here, we were only working out the variable element of it, our 2.25 times 15,000. That was our variable element of it. When we had to put it down in our total costing down here, we had to add in our additional 1,500 as the fixed cost, because we were going to pay that regardless of the output. So just stop and check your work. Just take that step back, take a breath, and then just make sure that you've added in both of these elements. So for semi-variable costs, when you're not given it broken down like this, you may have to work out from a total cost what are those elements, and that's what we're going to come on to next. So semi-variable cost then, you might have to use something called the HighLow method. So I'm going to walk you through it in words first of all, and then on the next slide we'll go into an example to show you actually how to put it together. Now, when I was learning this, most of the books that I was using and reading tended to kind of put it in about 4 steps. I was getting quite confused with the subtractions and the divisions and the multiplications, so I decided to break it down into 6 steps. So these are my 6 steps on how to do the HighLow method. So first of all, we're going to calculate the difference between the highest and the lowest total costs. So you'll be given a list of total costs and the outputs to what they relate to. So you want to take your highest and lowest and find the difference in the total costs. The second part of it is you're going to be calculating the difference between the highest and lowest outputs. So in that table you will have an output column. Just draw one up here quickly. So you'll have a total cost column and you'll have an output column, and you'll have various different figures here and various different figures here. So for step 1, you're going to take the highest cost and take away the lowest cost and make a note of that figure. And for step 2, you're going to take the highest output and the lowest output and find the difference between them. Because then in step 3, you're going to then find the variable cost. And to do that, you're going to divide the total cost by the total output difference. So the 2 figures you found in step 1 and 2 will then give you the variable cost. Once you've found your variable cost, you're then going to multiply either your highest or lowest output, and you're going to multiply it by the variable cost that you've just found. So you're going to take one of these, either the highest or the lowest, doesn't matter which, but only the highest or the lowest. You're going to multiply it by the variable cost you found in step 3 and make a note of that figure, because that is then going to be your variable element of your total cost. To then move on to step 5, you're going to then use your total cost for the output that you selected in step 4. So if you selected the highest one, stay with the highest one. If you selected the lowest, stay with the lowest. Take away the variable element that you found in step 4, and that will then give you your fixed cost. So you multiplied it out here by your highest or lowest. So if you chose your highest output, stick with your highest output in step 5 and take away the variable cost from that total cost, and that gives you your fixed cost. And then when you add the fixed cost you found in step 5 to the variable cost that you found in step 4, you should then equal your total cost that you were given in your question. Once you're happy that that is okay and those figures do add up, then the final step then is to always check it with another output level. So you could then take another output level and check, times it by your variable cost, add in your fixed cost, and do you then come back to the total cost that you're given in the question. So that sounds a bit wordy, it's quite difficult to explain, so let's go on and let's actually have a look at an example on how this all works. So let's work through an example then of the HighLow method. So a manufacturing company has the following total costs of production at different production levels. So we're given all of our production levels and how much at each of those levels our total cost is. So at 10,000 units produced, we pay £57,500. At 25,000 units, we go up to 83,750, and so on. So our first step then is going to be to find the difference between our highest cost and our lowest cost. Okay, so we're going to be finding the difference between our highest cost and our lowest cost. So step 1 is 162,500 minus 57,500, and that gives us 105,000. Then step 2, we're going to take our highest number of units, and our lowest number of units, and we're going to find the difference between them. So 70,000 minus 10,000 equals 60,000. Then step 3, we're going to then use the figures that we've just created in our first and second step to find our variable cost per unit. So we're going to do 105, which is the bit that we worked out in part 1, which is our highest cost minus our lowest cost. So we're doing 105. We're going to divide that by the highest output minus the lowest output. So we're going to divide that by 60,000, which gives us a variable unit cost of £1.75 per unit. Now we've got that, we can move on to step 4. So step 4, we're then going to either take our highest or our lowest number of units. So I am going to base my next few calculations on the highest. So We're then going to say our highest number of units was 70,000. Now we're going to multiply that out by the variable cost, variable element that we calculated in step 3. So that's 70,000 by 1.75. And that gives us a variable element of 122,500. When we look at this, if we stop here for a second, we can see that because we've worked out what our variable element is here for the 70,000, we're at 122,500, but we know the total cost is actually 162,500. So this is where we can now work out what our fixed element is. So for step 5 then, we're going to take the total cost of producing those 70,000 units. We're going to take away the cost, the variable cost that we've just worked out for that production level. And that then gives us our fixed element. So once we've got that, we need to just check that we have actually got that right. So in order to do that, we're going to use a different output level and check that it all works. So then I'm going to choose for our final step, our step 6, I'm going to choose to use the 25,000. So let's work this through then. We know that we've got 25,000 units and our variable cost per unit was £1.75. So our variable element is 43,750. We also know that we've got our fixed element of £40,000, which we worked out over here in step 5. And then if we add those two together, we get 83,750. So that total amount there, we can see then matches the total amount that we're given in the question. So we know that we've calculated our variable element and our fixed element correctly. So when you're tackling these questions, just remember, take it step by step. So work out your difference in your total costs first, then work out your difference in your units, in your highest and lowest units. Once you've got those two figures, you can then work out your variable cost per unit. Choose whether you're going to use your highest or your lowest output. Doesn't matter which, but make sure it's either the highest or the lowest. Then you can then calculate what the variable element is of that production level of production. And then once you've got that variable element, you can then take that away from the total cost that we know that's going to be to then find that additional fixed element. Then once you've done that, just be absolutely sure that you spend just a couple of minutes to then throw it into a different level of production. And that's where in step 6 here, you can then work out and prove that you can come back to the total cost. So my final thoughts then for this presentation are the fixed costs that always remaining the same. So it doesn't matter how many units you produce, you are always going to pay that same amount of cost, and that's going to be your rent, your rate, things like that. Your variable costs are going to change with your level of production. So as you produce more units, so therefore you're going to pay more with all of your variable costs. So they're your direct costs, your direct materials, direct labour. Your stepped costs are going to change, but only when you reach a certain level. Okay, so this is that for up to a certain level of production, you'll pay an amount, and then when you then step up to the next level of production, you're going to pay another amount. So anything up to that level, you're going to pay a certain amount, but it will change. So remember your steps, remember your boxes. Fill your box up, and then you're going to move into the next bracket. Fill your box up, you're going to move into your next bracket. Your semi-variable have both fixed and variable elements. So you may be given it in the question, so look out for that before you start calculating anything. Or you may have to work them out using the HighLow method, and which is what we went through in the previous slides. But however you need to work it out, and in any of the calculations you're doing, even for the variables and the stepped costs and things, just take it step by step. Look at each thing that you're given and identify what type of cost it is, and then have a look at how is that going to affect your calculation. So if you're given a rent cost, then you know that's going to stay regardless. So you can add that into your calculation as a full amount. Your variable cost, you're going to have to do a calculation as well, as will your stepped and your semi-variable. But just remember to take it step by step, take a step back and review it. Does it make sense? Do your figures make sense? And then most of all, practice will always help with you and succeeding. And I really do wish you all the very best of luck, and I hope this video has helped.